Welcome to Eat Well, Travel Often, a podcast about food, travel, the environment, mind, body, and spirit. I'm Melissa Goldberg, and over the course of my adult life, I've been focused on how to build an integrated community around food, health, wellness, and the environment. These are all related. Understanding these interrelationships helps us look at life as a holistic system and teaches us how to connect with each other to create a loving and thriving community. On Eat Well, Travel Often, I talk to farmers, foragers, cookbook authors, doctors, scientists, and entrepreneurs. All have one thing in common. The people I speak with are trying to better everyone's lives through their work and passion. These are the people who inspire me to be a better person. I hope to share with you my curiosity from everything from book to plate. And the goal of these conversations are to inspire you to eat well and travel often. For this episode, I am speaking with John Krueger from Circle Brook Farm. John and I have known each other for almost 10 years. Every summer, he provides my food cooperative with amazing vegetables. His farm is a diversified, certified organic vegetable farm. He grows almost every type of produce that is possible in our New Jersey climate. He specializes in heirloom varieties and even finds exotic varieties on his yearly trips to South and Central America. His core business is as a Community Supported Agriculture farmer, or CSA farmer. Members prepay for their produce prior to the season start and become shareholders in the farm. Since working with John, he has seen ups and downs of the CSA model and also has had many hard times due to climate change. However, coronavirus is hitting him harder than anything he has faced in the past. Farming is hard business, and his fortitude and strength is amazing in these challenging times. As you listen, think about all the farmers out there that face these challenges and be grateful to them every day to provide us with food on our table. All right. Welcome, John. Thanks for taking the time to talk to me. So farming, it's not a very glamorous career. Did you grow up wanting to be a farmer?
Well, no, I don't think I grew up wanting to be a farmer. I became interested in gardening when I was in high school. I read Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and became concerned about the chemicals that we were using to grow our food. I've always enjoyed the outdoors and been a nature lover, and was alarmed about the type of contamination that we were spreading around the planet. So I started learning how to garden. I became a farmer a bit later in life. I worked in construction and for a number of years, and continued to be an avid gardener.
So, but how did you decide to become an organic farmer? Like, what made you choose that over industrial farming? Like, what did you see the difference and how did you learn about it?
Well, as I said, it was from an environmental perspective. I was only ever interested in organic gardening. I went to school at Cook College, and over a number of years, I was involved with the Cook Organic Gardening Club, and so it was always organic agriculture that interested me. I got a degree in environmental science, but I took a number of courses that were related to agriculture. And I learned carpentry and had a construction business for a while and worked as a manager of a construction company. But I through a little bit of serendipity, I found myself applying for a job as a farm manager in 1995 for a farm here in North Jersey, and was able to sort of convert my knowledge of gardening to farming on a somewhat larger scale. I started going to conferences and learning more about equipment and food production on a larger scale.
Originally, you didn't own your farm, and now you do. How did that come about?
Well, yeah, as I said, I worked as a farm manager for 6 seasons for a farm here. And when the owner of that operation closed up, I went out on my own, working with an elderly gentleman down the road that I had gotten to know. Worked with him the first year, which was 2002, and then 2003, he let me take over his fields. I basically was farming on rented and borrowed land and borrowed equipment for a few years. After a few years in that location, things were very difficult there. The fields were very small. They were surrounded by woods. They were down in valleys with heavy clay soils, and I had a lot of problems both with rainy periods and with animals destroying my crops. I happened to run into another local farmer that I knew who had a 50-acre farm in Andover, and he was not really using much of it. So he offered me use of some of his fields, and I began farming here. A few years later, I noticed that there was a vacant house on the farm next door, and got in touch with the owner and was able to arrange to rent the house and the barn for as a base of my operations, and a few acres of fields that were contiguous with the house.
So
I rented.
go ahead.
I rented from 2008 until 2013, when he put the property back on the market. I had always known that he wanted to sell, and I was trying to save my money. I was sort of looking for investors, trying to find a way to be able to purchase the property. When he put it back on the market, I had some money saved up. I approached the Farm Credit East, which is the big agricultural lender, and they looked at my my business and my financials, and pretty much approved the loan, but told me I needed to come up with about $250,000 for down payment and closing costs, and I didn't have all of that. So I approached my CSA members. At that time, I had about 700 members in my various CSA groups, and I asked for people who would be willing to prepay for the 2014 season in November of 2013. And I was able to get 90 of my members to pledge to do that, which gave me the extra cash to be able to cover my down payment.
So let's talk about that. So people aren't usually aware where their food comes from, and you have a different way of distributing your food. You don't sell mostly to wholesale. You use a CSA. Can you talk about that? Like why you chose to be a CSA farmer, and what's different from a CSA farmer or having members than going to markets?
Well, there's several different aspects which make it advantageous. The first is that you begin getting money up front. Members begin registering and paying for their seasonal shares in January, February, March of the season, which gives the farmer the capital that he needs to purchase seed, to purchase fertilizer, and perhaps to pay workers. In my case, it enabled me to buy some equipment as well in order to be able to get started. So that's the one of the big advantages. A typical farmer goes to the bank and gets a loan and uses that for his startup capital each season, and then hopes that he has a good season and can pay off the loan by the end of the year, and then the next season comes around and he goes back to the bank and borrows the money again.
Well, let's step back. Let's just step back. A CSA, it's a community supported agriculture group. And some people may not know what that is. So basically, what you're doing is people are prepaying for their farm shares for the season, correct? And then they get the bounty of what you're doing. So you get the capital in advance. Is that a great way to explain it?
Yes. Yeah, the idea of a CSA is that the customer, the member, as we call them, prepays for the share at the beginning of the season or pre-season, pre-delivery anyway. And also another aspect is that the member is sharing the risk with the farmer. Farming is not only is it not a glamorous occupation, but it's also a very risky occupation. And weather can cause crop losses that can be devastating. So CSA members understand that at any given year, the farmer might have a lot of bounty and they might get a really good value for their investment. In a bad year, it might be a little bit less. Typically, weather-related problems affect one crop more than the other, and so it tends to balance out. One year it might be a bad year for tomatoes, but a great year for lettuce and other crops like that. And it might be the reverse the following year. But members accept basically what the farmer is able to grow. They accept seasonality. That's another big aspect of CSA farming. When you go to a market, you basically sell the things that people like. If you don't have broccoli, for instance, all through the summertime, then you're not going to get as much money. And on the other hand, if you grow a lot of something and people don't buy it, you take it to the market and then bring it home, and it usually has to be thrown on the compost heap. So with CSA, you know that you're going to be able to. You have pre-sold a lot of your vegetables so that you know that they are not going to go to waste.
Let's talk about the process. It's now almost April, and what's happening on the farm, and what does the next couple months look like for you? In a typical year, not a coronavirus year yet.
Yeah. Well, it's the COVID problem has not really affect what we need to do out in the fields. It's affecting our ability to do that because of issues getting workers here. But typically, we've been busy in the greenhouse since at least early March. We did start a few things in February in a little greenhouse that I built onto my back porch, which is easier to keep heated. But we're basically, March is a big greenhouse month. We've been planting all our tomatoes and peppers and eggplants, as well as transplant stock for cool weather crops like broccoli and cabbage, cauliflower. We have lots of onions that we've been growing. Typically in early April, depending on what the weather is going to allow, we start planting the first crops out in the field. The earliest crops that go in are peas, parsnips, spinach. Very soon we'll be planting potatoes. And then we'll also be starting to transplant our onions out into the field as well. After that, we start doing more direct seeded crops like carrots and beets. And usually in early May, we're able to start transplanting out some of the warm weather crops like tomatoes and eggplant. So that's basically what the spring looks like.
And you're an organic farmer. Can you talk about the difference between organic and conventional and why it matters?
Well, as I said initially, I became concerned with the pesticides being used in conventional agriculture, and felt that we needed to find safer, cleaner ways to grow our food. As I got more into organic agriculture, I began to realize that there was a little bit more to it than that. That's sort of reductionist thinking. That's sort of saying, well, if you eliminate this and replace it with this other thing, then that's going to make a difference. The real difference, you can think of organic farming as biological farming, or farming with nature, and part of that is the understanding that the soil, a real soil, a soil as you would find in a forest or in a typical natural setting, is actually an ecosystem. It's a complex web of soil microorganisms, fungi, bacteria, actinomycetes. There's just a world of creatures that live in the soil and create a very complex ecosystem. Earthworms, of course, one of the larger parts of that ecosystem, but the major part of it are microscopic types of bacteria and as I said, fungi. And organic farmers try to preserve that life in the soil. We find that if you have a rich, healthy soil, that you don't have the kind of disease issues that plague conventional farming. It's not only the pesticides and the herbicides that are used that destroy the life of the soil, but it's actually the fertilizers, the chemical fertilizers, which also kill the life. And once the soil becomes dead, that opens up a niche for harmful types of bacteria and creates more disease pressure. There's research that shows that the nitrates that are in the leaves of the plants are different from the chemical when they're coming from chemical fertilizers, and actually attract insects to those plants.
I actually even read recently that the microbiome in the soil has an effect on the microbiome in our guts. So what we're eating is coming, since there's no, in conventional farming, the microbiome in the soil is not good. So then we're eating that and it's ruining it in our guts. Have you ever heard of that?
Yes, actually, I mean, the understanding of our own intestinal flora and fauna has sort of paralleled our understanding of the biology of the soil, the microbiology of the soil, and that has also included a realization that there is an interaction with some of the bacteria and other things that we're exposed to from the soil that actually help our bodies to develop resistance to other types of pathogens. The other aspect of biological farming that's become more and more recognized and important, Rodale Institute's been a leader in doing organic research for many years, and they've been following the carbon cycle. And we've come to realize that not only can agricultural that agriculture can mitigate the effects of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and climate change by sequestering carbon in the soil. I mean, all forms of life essentially are carbon-based life forms. So if you have a rich organic soil, they are tying up lots of carbon.
So how much more expensive is it to grow organic than conventional farming? And does that really show in the price of the food or your food? Because is it true costs?
Well, I guess part of it is supply and demand in terms of what the value of the produce is, but it is more expensive to grow organically. Organic, to get your fertility from organic sources can be more expensive, and we do use some spray materials that are naturally derived and are quick to break down and relatively harmless to humans. But a big part of the added expense is that we don't have herbicides in our toolbox, and so that therefore organic requires a larger degree of hand labor to keep the weeds under control. So we use only mechanical cultivation and hand hoeing and weed removal. So that adds a huge labor cost to the cost of producing organic food.
You most conventional farmers grow one or two crops. You grow hundreds. How many different types of crops do you grow on your farm?
I haven't ever sat down to count, but I would say probably in the hundreds, at least probably 100 or so different types of crops, and then within that there are many different varieties. We're very big on heirloom vegetables. So, for instance, I grow 60 or more different types of tomatoes. We grow 20 or so different types of potatoes, lots of different types of lettuces. But since we do a CSA program and we do markets, we basically try to grow every type of crop that will grow in our environment. And I've even brought a few crops from South America that we're trying to produce here.
You've been a vegetable farmer for more than a decade, and you've been working with CSA for about 15 years or so. How has the CSA program changed, and has your members' taste changed over the years?
Well, the CSA model seems to be in decline at the moment. I started with my first CSA group in Montclair in 2003, and my membership grew very rapidly. I added a group or two different pickup sites every season from 2003 up until 2013 for 10 years. We went from 40 in 2003, 40 members to 700 in 2013, and in 2014 we got up to almost 800. After that, the membership began to decline. We went down to 700, then down to 600, and currently, I think last year we had around 500 members. There's a few different reasons for that, I guess. I think there was more competition for a time for CSA members. A lot more farms started offering CSA programs. In addition, some farm stands that were really just retailers, buyers and sellers, offered a similar box share program, and they were able to offer a lot more flexibility in terms of payment and in terms of taking time off, skipping weeks. So that was some competition there. And I think people sought out the CSAs because of at that time it was harder to find organic produce in the stores. Now there's a lot more organic produce in the supermarkets, and there are a lot more online providers of organic produce, Fresh Direct, and then now, of course, you've got all the meal programs which people are subscribing to, the meal kits. So, and I guess there's just sort of a demographic shift. I think that the members for many years were baby boomer generation who at this point their children have grown and have left the house, and then it's just the husband and wife, and they don't have a need for as much food. Maybe they're traveling more. So that's been, I think, a big part of the decline in CSA membership.
So we now have these big organic farms like in California who are growing, we can get it all in Whole Foods or even in in all our supermarkets. But is that true organic farming? Because they're just organic monoculture farms. Is it even helping the soil? Is it the full cycle? I mean, you have so many crops and they're feeding off each other and you get the bugs and the bees. Do these farms, are they even considered true organic?
Well, I think any move away from the use of large amounts of pesticides and of chemical fertilizer is a good thing. I don't think that they are producing food in a necessarily ecological or environmentally beneficial way, because, as you say, they are monocultures. The industrial organic from California tends to be more of what I referred to earlier as a reductionist approach, which is that you just eliminate your chemical fertilizer and you replace it with some natural source of fertility, and then you switch to a naturally derived spray material to control your insects. I don't think that the vast majority are really paying attention to actually building the life in the soil. A true organic farmer thinks of the slogan that we use is feed the soil, not the plants, and take care of your microbiology, and the microbiology will take care of the plants. So we now have an approach to agriculture which is going beyond organic, and it's being called regenerative agriculture. And it's what I say has a great potential to mitigate the climate change issues that we're now facing.
So we have been, locked down for 2 weeks right now so far for the coronavirus. How are you dealing with this, and what impact is this having on the farm?
Well, these are uncertain times. My initial thoughts when this began was that I should maybe cut back on my planting because we don't know what will happen with the markets. Will I be able to sell my product at the markets? As I said, CSA membership has been in decline, and as a result, I've become more and more dependent on farmers markets. And if the farmers market attendance is off, or markets are actually closed, I may not be able to sell some of what I've grown. But that thought passed very quickly because at this time, local agriculture is going to become even more important than ever. I think that we have definite possibility of interruptions of the supply chain. It's uncertain, how things will go on the California farms. And I think that, it's our responsibility as farmers to try and grow as much food as we possibly can. There's also going to be economic disruption and more food scarcity and more need. And so if I'm unable to sell what I grow, then it'll be donated. It will be put to good use. That being said, we're having issues with getting getting workers here. For 10 years now, I've been bringing in guest workers from Guatemala and Nicaragua, and unfortunately, I was unable to get them here and in place before things started becoming difficult, before travel became difficult. So it's currently uncertain if and when I will be able to get my crew of highly experienced workers here. At this point, we are asking for volunteers from the CSA and even from outside the CSA to help us get our season started. And we're taking it one step at a time to see what develops. I'm still hopeful of getting at least some of my workers here at some point, but I don't want to get behind with my planting. So we're trying to get going, as I said, with a little bit of volunteer help.
There have been massive job losses due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I think New York State reported that over 1 million new claims for unemployment have been filed. If you cannot get the workers up for Latin America, are you going to hire local people? And how hard is it to learn to be a farmer laborer? Like, can anybody do it? Like, what are you going to do?
No, it's there's actually a fair amount of skill involved in knowing how to trellis tomatoes and how to know when a melon is ripe. But it's also just efficiency and speed in harvesting. The biggest expense of and the biggest part of the labor of vegetable production is the harvest. And my workers are very efficient and fast at picking beans and peas, at cutting and bunching greens, arugula, spinach, root crops that are bunched. This is all very time consuming and it needs to be done quickly. But more so than skill is just the stamina and the ability to endure spending 10 or 12 hours a day outside. We start in the spring. Conditions are still cold. As we move into the summer, we're working out often in very, very difficult high temperature conditions. You're in the sun. And then as we move back into the fall, we're back into cold weather. When it's raining and we need to harvest, we're out working in the rain. So they're typically haven't seen too many Americans who are able to do this kind of work. You're bent over, you're on your knees. It's very, very difficult work. And so I know that there will be many unemployed people. I may need people to help do markets, and I'm willing to hire people where I need them. I do have some, local people who work for me, but they generally don't do the field work. The other aspect of that is that our government has already put in place aid for unemployed workers that essentially give them their full paycheck that they received previously. So it seems uncertain to me that people are going to want to come out and give that up to work long hours under very difficult conditions.
You mentioned to me before we started taping about there's will probably be restaurant workers, but they're not legal. What are the issues with hiring these type of workers?
Well, typically that workforce is typically undocumented, as you say, and the problem with that is that they generally need to be paid in cash. There's just no way for me to pay out those quantities of that quantity without being able to use that as a deduction on my taxes. I bring 15 workers from Guatemala and Nicaragua, as I said, and I spend over $300,000 a year. I pay them in salaries. They're paid by check. They're given 1099s. I can declare all of that expense on my income, off of my income tax liability. Paying people cash, I'm not able to do that.
Right. So let's go to talk about the food supply chain. Many people think that the food supply chain is safe, that there's no matter what, over the next 6 months or so, there are going to be groceries on the shelves, stocked with fresh fruits and vegetables. How concerned are you about this? And do you think that you can fill, with the farm, if you get enough workers, you can, help out on this and fill some of this void if it happens?
Well, yeah, there may be some people who think that the food supply chain is secure, but I think that there are a lot of people that are concerned with the supply chain as well. There's no flour on the shelves in the supermarkets right now. People are stockpiling canned goods and freezing meat and stockpiling a lot of things besides toilet paper. And the seed companies are experiencing an incredible surge in demand for seeds. I went to order seeds from a company that I order from, who typically ships the same day when you order by 2:00, and they are now shipping 7 days out because they have 30,000 orders to fill. So I think that there's a lot of concern among the general populace about the security of our food supply chain, and I think that local agriculture is going to be much more important and much more appreciated in these challenging times.
I was thinking that even some of these conventional farms that have a lot of workers, that they live in tight quarters and they're all together, that if one person gets sick, it spreads through the whole group of workers, and then where are the workers going to come from?
Yeah, that's a big concern. When I thought that I was still going to be able to get my workers here, that was one of the things that I was thinking about. They do live together in a sort of bunk style housing. I have a two-family house in the town of Newton nearby. I have 7 workers upstairs and 7 workers downstairs. And there's 2 bathrooms, one up and down. So they are in very close quarters. It was a concern to me how I would be able to keep my workers safe, and if one of them did get sick, how I would be able to separate them from the other workers. It's one of the things that I was starting to explore with a local health center that I work with. Of course, at this point, everything's on hold, so we're not really sure, how that's going to be possible. One of my thoughts was that I might need to buy a camper or something along those lines in order to have a space to quarantine a worker if one of them did get sick. So we're considering that possibility. If I see that I am going to be able to get my workers up here, I'll be looking for to buy some sort of a camper or a mobile home to have a space to separate a worker or 2 workers if they do get sick.
Do you is there any update from the government to see if these workers can come in, or do they have any type of program that they can maybe bring them in and quarantine them for a certain amount of time, or is it just silence right now?
Well, there are a few different issues with workers in general. One is that many of them were waiting for their interviews at the embassy. A part of the process of bringing workers in with a visa, it's a long, complicated process. Involves being certified by the Department of Labor, and once you're certified, then you apply to immigration for permission. And once you have that permission, the workers need to go to the embassy and the U.S. embassy in their local country for an interview. Many of the workers come from Mexico, and the embassies were shut down in Mexico. May still be shut down. At this point, they have decided to waive the interviews for workers who have been in the U.S. in previous years, certifying them as returning workers and not requiring the interview. In my case, the 4 workers from Nicaragua were unable to get their interviews because the embassy was closed. The embassy has now reopened, and they are scheduled for interviews this coming week. There's very little doubt that they will be approved because they've all been here before. My workers in Guatemala had their interviews on March 13th, and I had already bought tickets for all of them. I don't typically bring all of them at once. Early in the season, we only need 5 or 6 workers, and then a few weeks later, I need additional workers, but I wanted to get them all up here and in place, so I had bought tickets for all 11. 3 days before the first 6 were to arrive, the Guatemalan government closed its borders and its airport. So the issue at this point, all of my workers will have visas. The problem is that they do not have transportation. It remains unclear if and when Guatemala will open its airport. But when they do, there are no commercial flights. So what I'm working on now, I've already applied for the 11 workers for space on charter flights that were being organized by the Guatemalan, by the embassy, the U.S. embassy in Guatemala, for repatriating Americans who were stranded there. They give first priority, of course, to Americans, but there was a possibility that there would be some extra seats. I haven't heard anything back on that. My next step is to try and contact the Guatemalan authorities and see if they can be of assistance in coordinating with various farms that are trying to get workers here and organize charter flights to get workers for my farm and for various other farms. I may have better luck contacting an airline and trying to get them to facilitate that process.
I would think that if that happens, they would quarantine them for a little bit once they got here, though. Or hopefully test them all, but I don't know. Now, another question I have for you is, so once the CSA gets started, you may have to think of a new way of distributing just for safety reasons. Have you thought about that? Because right now, with my CSA and all the other ones, everybody comes and it's kind of like a market where you pick out of the bin the different things, but I don't know if that's the way to go in the future, or there may be another way. Have you thought about that?
Yes, I have been thinking about it, and just sort of trying to follow what the emerging thought and science around this is. But essentially, the typical model that we use of sort of a bulk distribution, which, as you say, requires people to go from tub to tub and pick out the various items that are in the share for that week and bag it themselves, may not be able to work. Every one of my groups works it a little bit differently, but many of the larger groups have volunteers who spend 6 hours or so through the course of a season, several different volunteer shifts where they sit at the pickup site and supervise the distribution. That's going to be something that people are simply not going to be willing to do, I'm afraid. And then, of course, you have the the question of whether somebody comes who is infected and touches something, and somebody else touches that and picks up the contamination, picks up the virus. So the only alternative, as far as I can see, is that all of the shares will have to be pre-bagged. Whether the CSA itself is able to bag at the site, or whether my workers here are going to have to bag, pre-bag everything, and we will ship everything for individual packages. That, unfortunately, one of the things that we've tried to do is give people choice on certain items, so you could go to a site and have a choice between kale and chard, or to be able to pick out the kind of tomatoes you wanted, or a lot of things like that, and that increases people's satisfaction. And in this type of a scenario, that won't be possible.
I would think, though, the way I see it with the CSA is that there's less hands going on the produce than if you went to the supermarket. You go to the supermarket, you don't know if someone picked up that lettuce, put it down, did this, what worker came by. I would think that it's less likely to get something from you, because it goes basically from your workers into the bin to us. And then, I would just think it would be a safer food supply chain than what we typically see in a supermarket.
Yes, no, I agree with you. I think it's definitely a less risky option. People are going to be wanting to avoid supermarkets as much as possible. It's much harder to achieve social distancing at a supermarket. Many of the sites, your site, for instance, is open air, so that's a big advantage. But there are still risks, and we're still trying to wrap our heads around how we have to deal with this. And my initial thought was that I was going to be taking everyone's temperature every day before they started work. Unfortunately, the science now is that you can be contagious, asymptomatic, or you can be contagious before full-blown illness, before a fever manifests. So that's another difficulty. Obviously, workers are going to have to wear gloves. Obviously, we're going to have to be very diligent about disinfecting our tubs and any type of a plastic surface. Apparently, this virus can live for a week or more on plastic and metal. So there's some concerns there. Obviously, there's concern about the drivers and their contact with everything. So it's going to be a challenging year. There's no way around it.
Well, if anybody could survive it, John, you can survive it, because you've had many challenging years, from rain to hurricanes to, all these things. So you can survive it. I've taken up so much of your time. You know how much I appreciate what you do. And I actually think that this year might be a good year for you. I mean, if you get your workers and you get the farm going and get things planting, I think that there's going to be a higher demand for what you do. And I think people are going to want to know where their food comes from and have a consistent amount of produce coming each week, so they'll feel comfortable that they're getting it. And you have eggs now too. So I'm being positive about this, and I'm optimistic. And, thank you so much for what you do. I really appreciate it. You are the heart of what we need in this country. So thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that, this has a potential to be a great boon for local agriculture. And I hope that people will stick with it. If we don't support the local farmers, we won't have local farmers, and we will be susceptible and vulnerable the next time that there's some disruption in the supply chain. So it's very important. we're going to do our best. We're going to grow as much food as we possibly can, and I think that it will all be put to good use. And thank you so much for everything that you do for us.
All right. Thank you, John. And I will post information how people can join the CSA, and if they don't live in New Jersey, how they can find other local sustainable farmers so they can support the local food system and keep everybody fed. So thank you, and be well. For everyone listening, please take the time to see if there is a CSA in your area. By joining a CSA, you will get a consistent source of food weekly, and you will be helping out the farmers. We are all a community, and just like the doctors and nurses that are on the front lines of this pandemic, so are the farmers. They are our lifeline. Thank you, John, for taking the time to speak with me. As I said in my interview, I am grateful every day for the food you provide me and my community through my CSA Farm and Fork Society. Please see the show notes on my website, eatwelltraveloften.net, where you will find info on how to find a CSA in your area. If you are local, I'll have information on how you can help John and his farm, or you can donate to purchase shares that I distribute to food pantries. There will also be information about Circle Brook Farm. Please email me at melissa@eatwelltraveloften.net or hook up with me on Instagram and Facebook at Eat Well Travel Often Podcast. Love to hear any interviews and recommendations you may have. Also on my website will be a mini documentary that I created of John. Thank you, eat well, and travel often. Just don't travel now.